Hello and welcome to Chuck's Culture Channel, your home for lively conversation on the lively arts in St. Louis and beyond. And this time around, my guest is St. Louis Symphony Orchestra Conductor Laureate Leonard Slatkin. He's here to talk about his tribute to the late composer and performer Peter Schickele and Schickele's alter ego, P.D.Q. Bach, the last and least of the many children of J.S. Bach. The concert, titled D Bach L, as in debacle, is performed and produced by the Chamber Music Society of St. Louis. It happens on November 25th, 2024, at the 560 Music Center, which you can see behind me right now. Leonard will talk about his friendship with Peter Schickele and what makes both his music and P.D.Q. Bach's so great. But first, how about a little bit of Peter Schickele's non-silly music right now? We're going to talk about Peter Schickele and how you got to know him and all things P.D.Q. Bach, I guess, that we can fit in about 10 minutes.
Happy to do so. And you started out by saying, how did I know him? And this is actually a really interesting story. At least I think it is. I was in public high school and junior high and elementary school for my childhood in Los Angeles. My high school, LA High, over in Olympic and Rimpau, had 3 choruses. It had 2 bands, an orchestra, and for 1 year, a composer in residence placed there by the Ford Foundation. And that composer was the young, slightly older than me, Peter Schickele.
Oh.
So we start out here by, first of all, looking at what the education system was like, at least in California, in those days. It's sad that we don't have things like that anymore, but the point is Peter spent, I believe it was an entire semester, working primarily with the chorus, but also creating what I remember very well, the Christmas pageant, and writing music for it. And this is just as he was coming out of Juilliard as a student. Then, since I got to know him a little bit, a couple of years later, I myself went to Juilliard, where Peter was putting on these strange programs of music by a composer that he had rediscovered, one P.D.Q. Bach. And the programs were outlandish, but they were done for very small audiences at the school. It was decided eventually that this had a broader audience, so they moved it to Town Hall in Town Manhattan. Among the interesting things here was that on that first concert was a piece called Iphigenia in Brooklyn.
Yes.
A cantata.
Oh.
And they needed a countertenor for this. I was asked to play at the auditions for those people who were vying for this coveted role. There were actually it was only one person auditioning, and that was Peter himself. I didn't know that. I didn't even know this was about. I just showed up. There was some music. I'm like, this is really weird. Okay. In comes Peter. He auditions for the producer and for others putting on the concert and doesn't get the job. He's turned down.
He wasn't really a countertenor, I don't think.
Peter could do everything. He really could. So it went to John Ferrante, who then would become the countertenor de jours. But in the succeeding and actually previous years, Peter was really expanding his own persona, and there are two very distinct ones. He got known, of course, for the P.D.Q. Bach, but he was already very active as a composer in many fields. He wrote music for the musical O Calcutta, one of those daring musicals of the 60s where, a few people didn't have clothes on for a very short number of seconds. He wrote music for a film called Silent Running, one of the first environmental impact films, but science fiction. He had a small trio called The Open Window. He wrote works, mostly chamber music pieces, for other ensembles. So he was really doing a lot of things. And then P.D.Q. Bach hit. The concert was a huge success. The recording equally so, if not more. And that put Peter on the national map. He was appearing on the Today Show. He would be on late night television with Dick Cavett. And all of this was in the physical guise of somebody completely disheveled. He would have a tailcoat that either had half a tail missing, his hair was crazy. He would make his entries sometimes by swinging Tarzan-like on a rope to get down the stage because his stagehand assistant would be out there looking for Peter. They couldn't find him and he was late. And he'd take this rope and swing down and bounce onto the stage and deliver usually very erudite but funny remarks.
Which he did, by the way, at one of his St. Louis visits, swung in.
He did. He did. And I would conduct for all the St. Louis visits, I believe. Maybe he did a few after I left. I'm not sure. He would go on, by the way, to publish not only these recordings, but
Yes, I have that. Yes, that's
like backwards. Is that backwards?
No, the definitive biography of P.D.Q. Bach.
And every music lover should get this book.
I agree. It's
a miracle. It is so funny. And if you really want to delve into it, you should go to one of the Amazon sites or whatever to actually get music of P.D.Q. Bach, because the notes for these things, not the physical notes that you play, but the actual written notes, in particular his what were they called, preludes and fugues in all the major and minor keys except the really hard ones. It's really funny, but the notes are just wonderful. So when I came to St. Louis, so that's 1968. So now we're a little under 10 years since I first met Peter in high school. And then a little bit over 6 years since I started working with him in New York. I get to St. Louis, and this idea right away, I think in my first year, I think maybe the second as assistant, was to do a concert at the zoo. So obviously Carnival of the Animals and a few other pieces like that. And I suggested that we ask Peter to write a piece that would be played outdoors and that would end with a march where animals would be brought out. And he wrote A Zoo Called Earth, also environmentally conscious because it had to do with an alien who comes to look at Earth to see if it's an interesting place. He says, yes, you have a decent place, but you got to take care of it better. We'll see what it's like when we return. He provided the vocal part on tape with his voice altered, and the piece has become quite the staple, especially in young people's concerts these days. We hear it quite often. Peter would continue to do P.D.Q. Bach, and he would continue to write. I commissioned his first symphony called Songlines that was done for the National Symphony of Washington. Then I did it with New York Philharmonic. We stayed friends for the rest of his life. He was always very kind. He even wrote, by the way, I had a festival in Minnesota that I used to do called Summerfest. And one of the staples of the festival became the piano extravaganza, which started out really as 4 pianos and then expanded to 10. And he would become the first composer to write a piece for us for 10 pianos. And the wonderful instruction in the score says we must pay particular attention to the pedaling because he's written it in such a way that can only be expressed by 10 pianos.
Yes.
He was a marvelous man, and I'm really happy that I guess about a year now since he passed, maybe a little less, I'm not sure. We're able to present this program honoring the memory of both Peter Schickele and P.D.Q. Bach.
Yeah. And of course, we are recording this on November 21st. The concert is just a few days away on the 25th. how did this come to be? I mean, who approached whom for this?
I think Mark Gordon
Okay.
suggested. I know each year they tried to do one fun-filled concert that usually came at the request of Dr. Robert Packman, who wanted this. And sometimes that concert was on April Fool's Day. And we decided to move it back, one due to my availability and others. So that all came together. We just had to decide what repertoire would be workable. So we have, I think, 3 pieces I conduct: the Eine kleine Nichtmusik, the Unbegun Symphony, which is the reverse of the Howdy Symphony, by the way. The Unbegun.
Yeah.
Schubert only finished 2 movements, so this has movements just 3 and 4. And the Howdy Symphony is a takeoff on the Farewell Symphony of Haydn, where everybody comes on stage as opposed to leaving. And then you're doing the Schlepptet, a parody of the Beethoven. But there are also Schickele pieces as well, a movement from the string quartet and a couple others. There's also a P.D.Q. Bach piece that one has to see in order to believe it. It's the Sonata for Viola 4 Hands.
That's the one yes, I was thinking that would make a great visual.
Yeah. It should be a delightful evening, filled with fun. I'm going to try and resurrect some of Peter's outlandish puns. That became a staple of Schickele concerts as well, at P.D.Q. Bach events. That he would say something that would be so outlandish the audience would just boo and hiss and greet it poorly. And I'll see. I haven't quite worked out exactly what I'm going to say yet, but by the time the concert comes, I'll either figure it out or just improvise.
Yeah. Well, given nearly all his titles are verbal jokes anyway, it's a natural combination. One of the things I like, Eine kleine Nichtmusik, I must tell you, is a favorite of mine of those compositions. That and his other quodlibets, because there is a form that no one does anymore, by George.
Well, hold on. I'm just going to turn around if you don't mind, because I have the music here. It says, this isn't the one. Hold on. Oh, I just dropped something, but that's all right. Yes. Here's what Peter said about the Unbegun Symphony, which is a Bedford Chamber Orchestra. He says, quote, "Spending as I do a significant part of my waking hours immersed in the music of history's most justly neglected composer, P.D.Q. Bach, it's not surprising that some of the more salient characteristics of his music should rub off on me. Among the many salient characteristics of P.D.Q. Bach's music, perhaps the most salient of all is that characteristic which has been called manic plagiarism. Although a certain amount of plagiarism can be found even in the greatest composers, it is my embarrassing duty to warn the listener that this unbegun symphony does not contain a single original theme. Every melody in the entire piece seems to have been thought of previously by somebody else. I hasten to point out that because of this fact, the Unbegun Symphony is one of the most consistently inspired works in the repertoire." Yes. And as you can see here on the score, this is not a P.D.Q. Bach piece. It's a Peter Schickele piece. So it has the earmarks of P.D.Q. Bach, but
Yeah,
some of the quotes come from the 20th century.
yes. Eine kleine Nichtmusik, for people who haven't heard, is, of course, Eine kleine Nachtmusik with a bunch of other stuff layered on top of it.
Yeah, it's actually played pretty much straightforward in the Mozart, and you're exactly right with that. Layered on top of it are melodies that work melodically and harmonically with what Mozart wrote. And it's just not fair to give it all away, because the fun is showing up and just saying, I know that. And even people who are not music connoisseurs, they'll enjoy this, because along the way, when you hear a William Tell overture quote or Tarara Boom Da come in this classical music, you're gonna laugh just because it seems so silly.
Yeah.
But sophisticated. And that's the fantastic thing about all this. This is the kind of humor that we don't really see very much of today, something that could only be done by a most accomplished musician. You could never pull this off just as slapstick. It's always a high degree of sophistication.
Yeah. It's a rare thing. I mean, the only other person who comes to mind immediately is Victor Borge.
Yeah, you would be one. Anna Russell would have been another.
Or yes, of course. How could I
Don't
forget?
forget Anna Russell and Dudley Moore, by the way, who was very sophisticated in his musical parodies, and a few others. But today we don't have anything like that. They're the duo Egglesman and Jew, but that's kind of more slapsticky than sophisticated.
Well, and then you got the melodica men, I don't know if you remember, but I mean, that's that's just not the same league.
No, no. So this is something unique, but a tribute to this wonderful person who I think will always be with us through both his music and his alter ego.
Yeah, I hope so. And yeah, one final thing that he shares with you is both of you, what you do, and he did really interesting radio shows. His was the Schickele mix.
Yeah. In a way, his was a slight model for what I do now with the Slatkin Shuffle. I've just taken it to a slightly more extreme view because mine's 2 hours instead of one. And it just goes all over the map. But he would have this subject that we went through. He scripted his shows. I do mine ad lib. But the inspiration always was Peter with the incredible shows. I hope they keep getting broadcast because his persona on the radio was remarkable.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And it's a kind of personal note here. It's kind of philosophy I adopted when I had a weekly show as well. I would just throw everything in. Because at the time I felt like I was on a one-man crusade against all the silos that the music industry.
Well, it's the Duke Ellington line, isn't it? There's only two kinds of music. There's good music and the other stuff.
Yes.
And we actually can operate by indeed playing good music, and we can play the other stuff too.
And make it all fit together. Well, is great. Leonard Slatkin, thanks so much for taking time from your schedule to do this. I'm looking forward to seeing you on stage here in St. Louis on the 25th. We will be there. I would not miss this for the world.
A good line. I will be there too, whether the world likes it or not.
Yes, very good. Meanwhile, folks, check out the links down here for information on P.D.Q. Bach, on Leonard Slatkin, and on anything else I think might be relevant to this conversation. And we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye, everybody.